The sound of my daughter-in-law's laughter during my husband's eulogy made my blood boil. I thought she was the cruelest woman alive, until I discovered the medical secret that explained everything and shattered my heart. My name is Ruth Sinclair, and I'm 64 years old. I live in Charleston, South Carolina, in a beautiful antebellum home that has been in my family for 3 generations. The house sits on a tree-lined street in the historic district, where Spanish moss drapes the ancient oak trees and the scent of magnolia blossoms fills the air during the spring months. This house has witnessed births, deaths, celebrations, and sorrows for over a century, and it has always been my sanctuary during life's most challenging moments. I retired 2 years ago after spending 35 years as a senior manager at First National Bank of Charleston. Banking was more than just a career for me. It was a calling that allowed me to help families achieve their financial dreams while building the kind of professional reputation that opened doors and commanded respect throughout our community. I was known for my attention to detail, my ability to solve complex financial problems, and my unwavering commitment to treating every customer with dignity and fairness. My late husband Harold was the love of my life and my partner in everything that mattered for 42 years of marriage. Harold worked as a civil engineer for the South Carolina Department of Transportation, designing bridges and highway systems that connected communities throughout our beautiful state. He was a quiet, methodical man who approached every project with the same careful precision he brought to our marriage and our family life. Harold and I met during our senior year at the University of South Carolina, where I was studying business administration and he was completing his engineering degree. We were both serious students from working-class families who understood the value of education and hard work. Our courtship was traditional and respectful, built on shared values, mutual admiration, and the kind of deep friendship that can sustain a marriage through decades of challenges and changes. We married 6 months after graduation and spent the early years of our marriage building careers and saving money to buy our first home. Harold's engineering projects often required travel throughout South Carolina, and I supported his career while advancing my own position at the bank. We always planned to have children, but we wanted to establish financial stability and professional credibility before starting our family. Our son Mitchell was born when I was 29 years old, after several years of trying to conceive and one heartbreaking miscarriage that tested our faith and our marriage. Mitchell's birth was a miracle that brought incredible joy to our lives and motivated us to be the best parents we could possibly be. We raised Mitchell with the same values that had guided our own lives: respect for education, commitment to hard work, importance of family loyalty, and the belief that character matters more than material success. Mitchell is now 35 years old and works as a certified public accountant for a mid-sized firm that specializes in tax preparation and financial planning for small businesses. He inherited Harold's methodical nature and analytical mind, along with my attention to detail and commitment to professional excellence. Mitchell has always been a responsible, reliable young man who made us proud through his academic achievements, his career success, and his dedication to building a stable, loving family of his own. 5 years ago, Mitchell married Meredith Caldwell, a 27-year-old real estate agent who had moved to Charleston from Atlanta to escape what she described as family drama and start fresh in a new city. Meredith is a strikingly beautiful woman with long blonde hair, green eyes, and the kind of polished appearance that comes from expensive clothing and professional styling. She speaks with a soft Southern accent and has impeccable manners that reflect a privileged upbringing and Southern Belle education. From the beginning of their relationship, I sensed that Meredith was hiding something beneath her perfect exterior. She rarely talked about her family in Atlanta, deflecting questions about her parents or siblings with vague comments about complicated relationships and different values. When Mitchell brought her home for holidays or family gatherings, Meredith was always charming and appropriate, but there was something guarded about her demeanor that suggested she was performing rather than genuinely connecting with our family. Meredith's real estate career has been successful, particularly in Charleston's competitive luxury market, where her beauty, charm, and professional presentation appeal to wealthy clients looking for historic properties or waterfront homes. She specializes in helping relocating families find appropriate housing, and her client testimonials consistently praise her attention to detail and her ability to understand their specific needs and preferences. Mitchell and Meredith have 2 children who are the absolute light of my life. Lily is 8 years old and has inherited her mother's beauty along with her father's intellectual curiosity. She excels in school, particularly in reading and creative writing, and she has a gentle, empathetic nature that makes her popular with both classmates and adults. Lily often asks thoughtful questions about family history and enjoys hearing stories about her grandparents' lives and the traditions that have been passed down through generations. Owen is 5 years old and embodies the boundless energy and enthusiasm that make young children such a joy to be around. He loves building with blocks, playing with toy cars, and helping his grandfather Harold with simple home improvement projects. Owen has Harold's mechanical aptitude and problem-solving abilities, often surprising adults with his ability to figure out how things work, and his creative solutions to everyday challenges. Harold was a devoted grandfather who treasured his time with Lily and Owen. He taught them about nature during walks through our neighborhood, helped them build elaborate sandcastles during beach vacations, and read bedtime stories with the kind of patience and enthusiasm that created magical memories for them. Harold often said that being a grandfather was even more rewarding than being a father because he could focus entirely on enjoying the children without worrying about discipline or long-term character development. The relationship between Harold and Meredith was cordial, but somewhat distant. Harold was naturally reserved with people he didn't know well, and Meredith's guarded nature made it difficult for them to develop the kind of warm, easy relationship that Harold had hoped to have with his daughter-in-law. They were always polite and respectful with each other, but there was never the genuine affection and comfortable familiarity that Harold had enjoyed with Mitchell's previous girlfriends. I tried to build a closer relationship with Meredith, inviting her for shopping trips, including her in family traditions, and making efforts to understand her interests and perspectives. However, these attempts were met with polite appreciation rather than genuine enthusiasm, and I often felt like Meredith was tolerating my attention rather than welcoming it. She seemed more comfortable maintaining distance and formality rather than embracing the kind of close family bonds that Harold and I valued so highly. There were subtle signs over the years that suggested Meredith was dealing with stress or anxiety that she didn't want to discuss with our family. She sometimes seemed distracted during conversations, would occasionally excuse herself from family gatherings for mysterious phone calls, and had a tendency to change the subject when discussions became too personal or emotional. Mitchell seemed aware of these patterns, but respected her privacy and didn't share details about whatever challenges she might be facing. Harold's death 3 months ago was sudden and devastating. He suffered a massive heart attack while working in our garden on a Saturday morning, dying almost instantly despite the paramedics' efforts to revive him. The shock of losing him so unexpectedly left me struggling with grief, loneliness, and the overwhelming task of planning a funeral that would properly honor his life and legacy. The funeral planning process revealed more about Meredith's mysterious background when she offered to help with arrangements, but seemed uncomfortable with the traditional religious service and formal visitation that are customary in Charleston society. She made several comments about preferring simpler approaches to memorializing the dead and seemed anxious about the large gathering of family and community members who would be attending Harold's service. "Ruth, are you sure you want such a big funeral?" Meredith asked during one of our planning conversations. "Harold was such a private person. Maybe he would have preferred something smaller and more intimate." Her suggestion seemed inappropriate and presumptuous, as if she understood Harold's preferences better than I did after 42 years of marriage. I attributed her comments to inexperience with Southern funeral customs and her apparent discomfort with large social gatherings. But her attitude added stress to an already difficult time. The day of Harold's funeral arrived on a warm September morning with clear skies and gentle breezes that seemed to reflect the peaceful nature of the man we were honoring. The service was held at First Presbyterian Church, where Harold and I had been members for over 30 years and where Mitchell had been baptized and confirmed. The sanctuary was filled with flowers, family members, colleagues, and community friends who had come to pay their respects to a man who had lived with integrity and contributed meaningfully to our community. What happened during that funeral service would change my understanding of my daughter-in-law forever and teach me profound lessons about judgment, compassion, and the hidden struggles that people carry with grace and dignity, even when no one else understands what they're enduring. Life in Charleston has a rhythm and elegance that reflects centuries of tradition and the kind of gracious living that makes the South famous for its hospitality and charm. My daily routine had settled into a comfortable pattern over the 2 years since my retirement from the bank, filled with volunteer work, garden club activities, book club meetings, and the precious time I spent with Lily and Owen when Mitchell and Meredith needed childcare assistance. Our historic district neighborhood is a living museum where every house tells a story and every garden reflects generations of careful cultivation and loving attention. My morning walks take me past homes that have sheltered families through the Civil War, Reconstruction, hurricanes, and the changing fortunes that have shaped Charleston's character over more than 3 centuries. The Spanish moss, wrought iron balconies, and flower-filled courtyards create an atmosphere of timeless beauty that has sustained me through life's challenges and celebrations. First Presbyterian Church sits at the heart of our community, both geographically and spiritually. The congregation includes many of Charleston's oldest families, along with newcomers who have been drawn to our city's unique blend of history, culture, and natural beauty. Harold and I had been active members for over 3 decades, serving on committees, participating in mission work, and building friendships that enriched our lives and strengthened our faith during difficult times. Pastor Williams had known Harold for 25 years and understood his character, his contributions to our community, and his devotion to family and faith. When I met with Pastor Williams to plan Harold's funeral service, we discussed the importance of creating a meaningful ceremony that would honor Harold's memory while providing comfort and inspiration to everyone who had been touched by his life. "Ruth, Harold was one of the finest men I've ever known," Pastor Williams said as we planned the service. His quiet integrity and steady faithfulness were examples to everyone who knew him. We want this service to reflect the depth of his character and the impact he had on all of our lives. The funeral arrangements included traditional elements that Harold would have appreciated, hymns that reflected his faith, scripture readings that provided comfort and hope, and a eulogy that would celebrate his life while acknowledging the grief of those who loved him. We planned for a large gathering, knowing that Harold's colleagues, community involvement, and 42 years of Charleston residency had created relationships that spanned multiple generations and diverse social circles. Mitchell handled many of the practical details with the efficiency and attention to detail that made him successful in his accounting career. He coordinated with the funeral home, arranged for flowers, and managed communications with out-of-town relatives who would be traveling to Charleston for the service. Mitchell's grief was profound but controlled, reflecting the same steady composure that Harold had demonstrated throughout his life. Meredith's involvement in the funeral planning was helpful but somewhat detached, as if she was providing professional assistance rather than participating as a grieving family member. She offered to handle coordination with the caterer for the post-service reception, managed logistics for visiting relatives who needed accommodation recommendations, and helped with childcare arrangements for Lily and Owen during the more formal aspects of the funeral proceedings. "I want to make sure everything goes smoothly so you can focus on grieving and honoring Harold's memory," Meredith said when she volunteered to handle these practical responsibilities. Her offer was thoughtful and generous, but her emotional distance seemed inappropriate for someone who had been part of our family for 5 years and who should have been mourning the loss of her father-in-law. The days leading up to the funeral were filled with visits from friends and relatives, flower deliveries, and the constant activity that surrounds death in Southern communities, where supporting grieving families is considered both a social obligation and a sacred duty. Our house was rarely empty, with church members bringing casseroles, neighbors offering assistance with household tasks, and family members sharing memories and providing emotional support. Meredith seemed overwhelmed by the constant stream of visitors and the formal expressions of sympathy that are customary in Charleston society. She often excused herself from conversations with extended family members or family friends, claiming that she needed to check on the children or handle phone calls related to her real estate work. Her frequent absences were noticed by several relatives who commented on her apparent inability to participate fully in family grieving rituals. "Is Meredith feeling all right?" my sister-in-law asked during one of these gatherings. "She seems distracted and uncomfortable, like she doesn't want to be here with the family during this difficult time." I made excuses for Meredith's behavior, suggesting that she was probably overwhelmed by grief and the demands of managing 2 young children during such an emotional time. However, privately, I was beginning to feel hurt and frustrated by her apparent detachment and her failure to provide the kind of emotional support that I needed from my daughter-in-law during the most difficult period of my life. The night before the funeral, our house was filled with family members who had traveled from other states to pay their respects to Harold and provide support during the service. Meredith prepared dinner for everyone with her usual efficiency and attention to detail, but she seemed anxious and preoccupied throughout the evening. She kept checking her phone, excusing herself for private conversations, and appearing generally uncomfortable with the family gathering. "Mom, is everything okay with Meredith?" Mitchell asked me privately during the evening. "She seems really stressed, and I'm worried about how she's handling all of this." Mitchell's concern for his wife was touching and appropriate, but it also highlighted the fact that even he didn't fully understand what was causing Meredith's obvious distress. I suggested that she was probably just overwhelmed by the combination of grief, family obligations, and the responsibility of caring for Lily and Owen during such an emotional time. The morning of Harold's funeral dawned clear and beautiful, with the kind of perfect September weather that Harold had always loved for working in our garden or taking family walks through the historic district. I woke up early and spent time in quiet reflection, thinking about our 42 years of marriage and the memories we had created together in Charleston's welcoming embrace. Getting ready for the funeral required careful attention to appropriate clothing, jewelry, and appearance that would reflect both my grief and my respect for the solemnity of the occasion. I chose a black dress that Harold had always complimented, along with the pearl necklace he had given me for our 25th wedding anniversary. Looking in the mirror, I could see the toll that grief had taken on my appearance, but I also saw the strength and dignity that Harold had always admired in me. Lily and Owen were dressed in their best clothes, looking solemn and beautiful, but clearly confused about the emotions and activities surrounding their grandfather's death. I spent time with them before we left for the church, explaining what would happen during the service and assuring them that all the people who would be there loved Grandpa Harold and wanted to honor his memory. "Grandma Ruth, will Grandpa Harold be sad that we're all crying?" Lily asked with the kind of innocent wisdom that children often demonstrate during difficult times. "No, sweetheart," I told her. "Grandpa Harold knows that we cry because we love him so much, and that makes him happy even though he's in heaven now." Mitchell looked handsome and dignified in his dark suit, though I could see the strain of grief in his face and posture. He had been Harold's pride and joy, and the loss of his father was clearly devastating despite his attempts to remain strong for his family's sake. Meredith appeared perfectly groomed and appropriately dressed, but there was something tense and fragile about her demeanor that suggested she was struggling with more than normal funeral emotions. The drive to First Presbyterian Church was quiet and reflective, with each of us lost in our own thoughts and memories about Harold and the impact his death would have on our family's future. The church parking lot was already filling with cars when we arrived, indicating that the service would be well attended by the many people whose lives Harold had touched through his work, his faith, and his community involvement. As we entered the church sanctuary, I was moved by the beautiful flowers, the soft music, and the gathering of friends and family who had come to honor Harold's memory and support our family during this difficult time. The atmosphere was reverent and comforting, exactly what Harold would have wanted for his final goodbye to the community he had served and loved for so many years. What was about to happen during that sacred service would challenge everything I thought I knew about my daughter-in-law and teach me profound lessons about hidden struggles, public judgment, and the difference between what appears to be happening and what is actually happening in someone's life. The funeral service began with the kind of dignified solemnity that Harold would have appreciated as our family was escorted to the front pews of the sanctuary where we would be closest to the pulpit and surrounded by the love and support of our faith community. The church was filled to capacity with Harold's colleagues from the Department of Transportation, neighbors from our historic district, members of our congregation, and family friends who had shared decades of memories with us. Pastor Williams opened the service with a prayer that acknowledged our grief while celebrating Harold's life and the legacy of faith, integrity, and service that he had left for all of us to remember and emulate. The congregation joined in singing "Amazing Grace," Harold's favorite hymn, and the familiar words provided comfort and strength during those first difficult moments of formally saying goodbye to the man who had been the center of my world for 42 years. The scripture readings were chosen to reflect Harold's faith and his belief in eternal life, with passages from Psalms and the Gospel of John that spoke to the hope of resurrection and the promise that death is not the end of love or relationship. Family members and close friends had been invited to share brief remembrances of Harold, and their words painted a picture of a man whose quiet integrity and steady faithfulness had touched countless lives in ways both large and small. Harold's brother spoke about their childhood together and Harold's early determination to become an engineer so he could build things that would help people and last for generations. A colleague from the Department of Transportation shared stories about Harold's dedication to safety and his innovative solutions to engineering challenges that had improved travel throughout South Carolina. Mitchell offered a touching tribute to his father's role as both parent and mentor, describing Harold as the man who taught me that character is more important than success and that treating people with respect is more valuable than any achievement. Throughout these early portions of the service, I was aware of Meredith sitting beside me, but I was too focused on the ceremony and my own grief to pay close attention to her reactions or emotional state. She seemed appropriately solemn and respectful, participating in the hymns and prayers in ways that suggested she was following the service and honoring Harold's memory along with the rest of our family. Pastor Williams began his eulogy with personal reflections about Harold's character and his contributions to our church community over the 25 years they had known each other. He spoke about Harold's quiet generosity, his willingness to help with maintenance projects around the church, and his faithful participation in mission work that had taken him to hurricane-damaged communities along the coast where his engineering skills were desperately needed. Harold Sinclair was the kind of man who never sought recognition for his good works, Pastor Williams said, his voice carrying the warmth and authority that had made him beloved by our congregation for over a decade. He believed that faith should be demonstrated through actions rather than words, and his life was a testament to the power of quiet service and steady devotion to family and community. As Pastor Williams continued his eulogy, describing Harold's love for his family and his pride in watching Mitchell grow into a successful, responsible man, I became aware of unusual sounds coming from beside me. At first, I thought Meredith was crying or struggling to control her emotions, which would have been completely understandable given the solemnity of the occasion and the loss our family was experiencing. But as I turned slightly to check on her, I realized with shock and horror that the sounds coming from Meredith were not sobs or sniffles. They were quiet but unmistakable giggles and suppressed laughter that seemed completely inappropriate and disturbing given the sacred nature of the funeral service. I stared at Meredith in disbelief, trying to understand what could possibly be causing her to laugh during her father-in-law's eulogy. Her face was turned down toward her lap, and her shoulders were shaking in a way that I had initially mistaken for grief, but now recognized as barely controlled amusement. The soft sounds of her laughter were becoming more audible, and I could see other family members beginning to notice her bizarre behavior. Pastor Williams was speaking about Harold's devotion to me and our 42 years of marriage, describing the love and partnership that had sustained us through life's challenges and joys. Harold often told me that marrying Ruth was the smartest thing he ever did, Pastor Williams said with a gentle smile. Their marriage was a beautiful example of what commitment and mutual respect can accomplish when two people truly love each other. At this moment, Meredith's suppressed laughter became more pronounced, and she seemed to be struggling unsuccessfully to control whatever was causing her inappropriate amusement. The contrast between Pastor Williams' reverent words about our marriage and Meredith's inexplicable laughter was jarring and deeply offensive to me. I reached over and gently touched Meredith's arm, hoping to get her attention and help her regain her composure before her behavior became even more noticeable to the congregation. When she looked up at me, I was shocked to see that her face showed no signs of amusement or conscious awareness of her laughter. Instead, she looked distressed and embarrassed, as if she was as surprised by her behavior as I was. "I'm sorry," she whispered almost inaudibly, her eyes filled with what appeared to be genuine anguish and confusion. "I can't help it." Her whispered apology and obvious distress made her laughter even more disturbing and incomprehensible. If she wasn't deliberately being disrespectful, what could possibly be causing her to laugh during such a solemn and sacred moment? Her behavior seemed to suggest some kind of emotional breakdown or psychological crisis that was manifesting in completely inappropriate ways. Pastor Williams continued his eulogy, describing Harold's relationship with his grandchildren and the joy that Lily and Owen had brought to his final years. Harold loved being a grandfather more than almost anything else in life, Pastor Williams said. He spent countless hours teaching Lily and Owen about nature, reading them stories, and sharing the wisdom and values that had guided his own life. As Pastor Williams spoke about Harold's love for the grandchildren, Meredith's laughter became even more pronounced and harder to suppress. She was now covering her mouth with her hand and bending forward in her pew, clearly struggling to control whatever was causing her to react so inappropriately to the eulogy. Her behavior was becoming impossible to ignore, and I could see people throughout the congregation turning to stare at our family with expressions of confusion and disapproval. Mitchell noticed his wife's behavior and leaned over to whisper something in her ear, presumably asking if she was all right or trying to help her regain control. Meredith shook her head frantically and seemed to be trying to communicate that she couldn't control whatever was happening to her, but her continued laughter made it impossible for anyone to understand what was wrong or how to help her. The situation reached a crisis point when Pastor Williams concluded his eulogy with a prayer thanking God for Harold's life and asking for comfort and strength for his family during our time of grief. As the congregation bowed their heads in reverent prayer, Meredith's laughter burst out loudly enough to be heard throughout the sanctuary, creating a moment of shocked silence that felt like a desecration of the sacred ceremony. I was mortified beyond words by what seemed like my daughter-in-law's deliberate disruption of Harold's funeral service. The contrast between Pastor Williams' beautiful words honoring Harold's memory and Meredith's inexplicable laughter felt like a betrayal of everything sacred about the occasion. I couldn't understand how someone could be so cruel and disrespectful during such a solemn moment, especially someone who was supposed to be part of our family and who should have been grieving along with the rest of us. Mitchell quickly escorted Meredith out of the sanctuary, leaving me to sit with Lily and Owen while trying to maintain my composure and dignity despite the humiliation and confusion I felt about what had just happened. The congregation seemed unsure how to react to the disruption, and Pastor Williams continued with the closing portions of the service, while everyone tried to pretend that nothing unusual had occurred. As the service concluded and we prepared to move to the cemetery for the burial ceremony, I was overwhelmed with anger and hurt about Meredith's behavior. I couldn't understand what could have motivated her to laugh during Harold's eulogy, and I was devastated that such a beautiful and meaningful service had been marred by what seemed like deliberate disrespect from someone who should have been honoring Harold's memory. The drive to the cemetery was tense and uncomfortable, with Mitchell trying to explain that Meredith wasn't feeling well and had needed to leave the service early. He seemed genuinely confused and distressed by his wife's behavior, but he was also clearly trying to protect her from the family's anger and disappointment about what had happened during the funeral. "Mom, I don't understand what happened in there," Mitchell said quietly as we followed the hearse to Magnolia Cemetery. "Meredith seems really upset, but she won't tell me what's wrong or why she was acting so strangely during the service." I didn't know how to respond to Mitchell's confusion because I was struggling with my own anger and bewilderment about Meredith's behavior. All I knew is that she had somehow turned Harold's beautiful funeral service into an embarrassing spectacle that I would never be able to forget or forgive. Little did I know that within hours I would discover the devastating truth about what had caused Meredith's behavior, and that my anger would transform into profound compassion and regret about my rush to judgment. The burial service at Magnolia Cemetery proceeded without Meredith's presence, as Mitchell had taken her home immediately after her disruptive episode during the church service. I stood beside Harold's grave with Lily and Owen, surrounded by family and friends who offered comfort and support, while I struggled to focus on the ceremony rather than on my anger and embarrassment about my daughter-in-law's inexplicable behavior. Pastor Williams conducted a brief graveside service that provided closure and peace, but I found it difficult to concentrate on his words, while my mind kept returning to the sound of Meredith's laughter during the eulogy. The contrast between the dignity of Harold's burial and the chaos of Meredith's disruption created a painful tension that overshadowed what should have been a purely reverent and healing experience. After the burial, family and friends gathered at our house for the traditional post-funeral reception where people could share memories, offer comfort, and celebrate Harold's life in a more informal setting. The house was filled with flowers, food, and the gentle conversations that help grieving families begin the long process of adjustment to life without their loved one. Throughout the afternoon, I was aware that several people asked about Meredith's absence and her behavior during the church service. I tried to deflect these questions with vague explanations about her being overwhelmed by grief or not feeling well, but I could see that many people were confused and concerned about what they had witnessed during the funeral. "Ruth, is Meredith all right?" asked Mrs. Patterson, our elderly neighbor, who had known our family for over 20 years. Her behavior during the service was so unusual. I've never seen anything like that at a funeral before. Mrs. Patterson's question was typical of the concerns that multiple people expressed throughout the afternoon. While everyone was too polite to directly criticize Meredith's behavior, their questions made it clear that her laughter during the eulogy had been noticed and remembered by many members of the congregation. Mitchell returned to the reception without Meredith, explaining that she was resting at home and would not be joining us for the remainder of the day's activities. He seemed distressed and confused about his wife's condition, but he was reluctant to discuss details about what had happened or what might be causing her apparent emotional breakdown. "Mitchell, I need to understand what happened during the service," I said when we had a private moment away from the other guests. "Meredith's behavior was completely inappropriate and hurtful. She laughed during your father's eulogy. How could she be so disrespectful at such a sacred moment?" Mitchell's response was defensive, but also bewildered. "Mom, I know how it looked, but I don't think Meredith was trying to be disrespectful. She seemed as upset about her behavior as everyone else was. Something was wrong, but I don't understand what it was or why it happened." His willingness to defend Meredith despite her obviously inappropriate behavior frustrated me, but it also suggested that he genuinely believed there was some explanation for what had occurred that went beyond simple cruelty or disrespect. However, without understanding what that explanation might be, I remained angry and hurt by what felt like a deliberate disruption of Harold's funeral service. The reception concluded in the early evening, and after the last guest departed, I was left alone in our house for the first time since Harold's death. The silence was overwhelming, and I found myself replaying the events of the day, trying to understand how such a beautiful service honoring Harold's memory could have been marred by such bizarre and hurtful behavior from someone who was supposed to be part of our family. I decided that I needed to confront Meredith directly about her behavior and demand an explanation for what had happened during the funeral service. Her laughter during Harold's eulogy felt like a violation of everything sacred about the occasion, and I couldn't move forward with our family relationship until I understood what had motivated such cruel and inappropriate conduct. The next morning, I drove to Mitchell and Meredith's house with the intention of having a serious conversation about respect, family obligations, and appropriate behavior during times of grief and mourning. I was prepared to express my anger clearly while also giving Meredith an opportunity to explain herself and apologize for the pain her actions had caused. Mitchell answered the door, looking tired and stressed, clearly still struggling with the events of the previous day and their impact on our family relationships. He invited me in but seemed reluctant to discuss the situation, suggesting that perhaps we should wait a few days before trying to address what had happened during the funeral. "Mom, Meredith is really upset about yesterday," Mitchell said as we sat in their living room. "She knows her behavior was inappropriate, but she's having trouble explaining what happened or why she couldn't control herself during the service." I insisted on speaking with Meredith directly, feeling that any resolution of the situation required a face-to-face conversation about her behavior and its impact on our family. Mitchell reluctantly agreed to call her downstairs, though he warned me that she was fragile and emotional and might not be able to discuss the situation clearly. When Meredith appeared, she looked exhausted and distressed, with red eyes that suggested she had been crying for hours. Her usual polished appearance was replaced by casual clothes and minimal makeup, and she seemed almost fragile in a way that I had never seen before. Despite my anger about her behavior, I was struck by how genuinely upset she appeared to be about what had happened. "Meredith, I need you to explain what happened yesterday during Harold's funeral," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and controlled despite my strong emotions. "Your laughter during the eulogy was hurtful and disrespectful, and I deserve to understand what could have motivated such inappropriate behavior." Meredith's response was immediate tears and what appeared to be genuine anguish about the situation. "Ruth, I am so sorry about what happened yesterday. I would never intentionally disrespect Harold's memory or hurt you during such a difficult time. Something is wrong with me, but I don't know how to explain it or make people understand." Her obvious distress and sincere apology caught me off guard, as I had expected either defensive justifications or casual dismissal of the impact her behavior had created. Instead, she seemed as confused and upset about her laughter as I was, which suggested that whatever had happened was more complicated than simple disrespect or intentional cruelty. "Meredith, what do you mean when you say something is wrong with you?" I asked, beginning to suspect that there might be factors involved in the situation that I didn't understand. Her response was hesitant and fearful, as if she was struggling with whether to reveal information that she had been keeping private. She looked at Mitchell uncertainly, and he nodded encouragingly, suggesting that they had discussed sharing something important with me. "Ruth, I've been seeing doctors for several months about some health issues that I haven't told the family about," Meredith said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I didn't want to worry anyone or create problems, especially while Harold was dealing with his own health concerns." The revelation that Meredith had been dealing with undisclosed health problems immediately changed my understanding of the situation and made me realize that there might be medical explanations for her bizarre behavior during the funeral service. "What kind of health issues?" I asked, feeling my anger beginning to transform into concern and curiosity about what she might have been hiding from our family. Meredith went to her purse and retrieved a folder containing medical documents and test results that she had apparently been carrying with her. Her hands were shaking as she pulled out papers that looked official and comprehensive, suggesting that whatever health problems she was facing were serious and had required extensive medical evaluation. "I've been diagnosed with something called pseudobulbar affect," Meredith said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's a neurological condition that causes uncontrollable emotional outbursts that don't match what I'm actually feeling. When I'm stressed or emotional, I sometimes laugh or cry involuntarily, even when those reactions are completely inappropriate for the situation." The medical documents she showed me included detailed explanations of pseudobulbar affect, a condition I had never heard of, but which apparently affects people with various neurological disorders and can cause exactly the kind of inappropriate emotional responses that Meredith had displayed during Harold's funeral. "The doctors say it's often triggered by stress or emotional situations," Meredith continued, tears streaming down her face. "Yesterday was incredibly stressful for me because I loved Harold, and I was genuinely grieving, but my brain was sending signals that made me laugh instead of cry. I couldn't control it, and I was mortified that it was happening during such an important and sacred moment." As I read through the medical documents and learned about pseudobulbar affect, I began to understand that Meredith's laughter during the funeral had not been intentional disrespect, but rather an involuntary neurological symptom that she had been struggling to control and hide from our family. The realization that I had completely misunderstood the situation and had spent 24 hours angry at someone who was actually suffering from a serious medical condition was devastating and humbling. My rush to judgment and my assumptions about Meredith's character had caused me to miss the truth about what was really happening in her life. But as I continued reading the medical documents, I discovered that pseudobulbar affect was not a standalone condition. It was a symptom of other, more serious neurological disorders that would explain why Meredith had been so secretive about her health problems and so reluctant to discuss her family background or her reasons for moving to Charleston. As I continued reading through Meredith's medical documents, my heart began to sink as I realized that pseudobulbar affect was not the complete extent of her health problems. The neurological condition that had caused her inappropriate laughter during Harold's funeral was actually a symptom of a much more serious and devastating diagnosis that explained why she had been so secretive about her medical situation and her family history. "Meredith," I said, looking up from the medical reports with growing alarm, "these documents mention that pseudobulbar affect is secondary to another condition. What is the primary diagnosis that's causing these neurological symptoms?" Meredith's face crumpled as she realized that I was beginning to understand the full scope of her medical situation. She looked at Mitchell with an expression that combined fear, sadness, and the exhaustion that comes from carrying a devastating secret while trying to maintain normal family functioning. "Ruth, the pseudobulbar affect is caused by early-onset Huntington's disease," Mitchell said quietly, clearly struggling with his own emotions about his wife's diagnosis. "Meredith was diagnosed 18 months ago, but she didn't want to tell the family until she absolutely had to." The words, Huntington's disease, hit me like a physical blow as I began to understand the magnitude of what Meredith had been hiding from our family. Huntington's disease is a progressive, hereditary neurological disorder that causes the gradual breakdown of nerve cells in the brain, leading to movement, cognitive, and psychiatric disorders that eventually become completely debilitating. "Meredith, how long have you known?" I asked, my voice shaking as I tried to process the implications of her diagnosis for her own future and for Lily and Owen's potential genetic risk. "I started having symptoms about 2 years ago," Meredith said, tears streaming down her face. "Small things at first, involuntary movements, difficulty concentrating, and occasional emotional outbursts that I couldn't control. I saw multiple doctors before getting the definitive diagnosis through genetic testing. The medical documentation painted a devastating picture of Meredith's prognosis. Huntington's disease typically progresses over 10 to 20 years, gradually destroying a person's ability to walk, talk, think clearly, and control their emotions. There is currently no cure and no treatment that can slow the progression of the disease, meaning that Meredith was facing a future of gradual but inevitable deterioration. The reason I moved to Charleston from Atlanta was because my mother has Huntington's disease," Meredith continued, her voice breaking with emotion. "I watched her deteriorate over several years, and when I started showing symptoms myself, I couldn't bear to stay in Atlanta where everyone knew about our family's medical history. The revelation about Meredith's mother explained her reluctance to discuss her family background and her apparent discomfort with close family relationships. She had been trying to escape the stigma and emotional trauma associated with Huntington's disease, while also attempting to build a normal life and family before her own symptoms became too severe to hide." "Meredith, why didn't you tell us about this when you were first diagnosed?" I asked, beginning to understand the impossible emotional burden she had been carrying while trying to be a wife, mother, and daughter-in-law. "Because I didn't want Harold and you to see me differently or to worry about Lily and Owen's genetic risk before it was absolutely necessary," she said. Each child of a Huntington's parent has a 50% chance of inheriting the gene mutation. I wanted Lily and Owen to have normal childhoods for as long as possible before they have to face the possibility of developing the disease themselves. The genetic implications for my grandchildren were staggering and heartbreaking. Both Lily and Owen faced a 50% probability of eventually developing the same devastating disease that was already beginning to affect their mother's neurological functioning. They would need genetic testing when they reached adulthood to determine whether they had inherited the gene mutation, and they would have to live with uncertainty about their own futures until those tests could be performed. "The symptoms are getting worse," Meredith continued, showing me additional medical reports that documented the progression of her condition over the past 18 months. "The pseudobulbar affect episodes are becoming more frequent and harder to control, especially when I'm stressed or emotional. Yesterday, during Harold's funeral, I was genuinely grieving and feeling overwhelming sadness, but my brain was sending signals that made me laugh instead of cry." Mitchell explained that he had known about Meredith's diagnosis for several months, but had respected her decision to keep the information private until her symptoms became too obvious to hide. He was struggling with his own grief about his wife's prognosis, while also trying to support her emotionally and help her maintain as much normalcy as possible for Lily and Owen's sake. "We've been trying to make the most of the time we have while Meredith is still relatively functional," Mitchell said. "The doctors say she probably has several years before the symptoms become severely debilitating, but we know that every day is precious because we don't know how quickly the disease will progress." The courage and strength that Meredith had demonstrated by hiding such a devastating diagnosis while continuing to function as a wife, mother, and family member was overwhelming to contemplate. She had been dealing with the knowledge that she was facing progressive neurological deterioration while also worrying about her children's genetic risk and trying to maintain normal family relationships with people who had no understanding of her situation. "Meredith, I am so sorry for the way I reacted to your behavior yesterday," I said, feeling ashamed of my anger and judgment when she had actually been struggling with involuntary neurological symptoms. "I had no idea what you were dealing with, and I completely misunderstood what was happening." "Ruth, you couldn't have known," Meredith replied with a grace and forgiveness that made her character even more admirable. "I deliberately kept this information private because I didn't want to burden the family or change the way people treated me. I wanted to continue being seen as Lily and Owen's normal mother and Mitchell's healthy wife for as long as possible." As I continued reading through her medical documents, I learned that Meredith had been working with neurologists, psychiatrists, and genetic counselors to manage her symptoms and plan for her family's future as her condition progressed. She had been incredibly proactive and responsible in seeking medical care and preparing for the challenges ahead, even while maintaining the facade of normalcy that had fooled our entire family. "The hardest part is knowing what this means for Lily and Owen," Meredith said, her voice filled with the anguish that comes from understanding that your children may be facing the same devastating future that you're experiencing. "They're too young to understand genetic testing or long-term prognosis, but eventually they'll need to know about their risk and make decisions about their own futures." The medical reports indicated that Huntington's disease symptoms typically appear between the ages of 30 and 50, meaning that Lily and Owen would face decades of uncertainty before knowing whether they had inherited their mother's gene mutation. They would have to make decisions about education, career, marriage, and having children without knowing whether they would eventually develop the same neurological disorder that was destroying their mother's brain function. "Mitchell, how are you coping with all of this?" I asked, realizing that my son had been carrying an enormous emotional burden while also dealing with his father's death and his own grief about losing Harold. "Some days are harder than others," Mitchell admitted. "I love Meredith, and I want to support her through this disease, but it's scary to think about what the future holds for our family. I'm trying to focus on making the most of the time we have while she's still herself, but I also need to prepare for eventually caring for her as her symptoms get worse. The conversation continued for several hours as Meredith and Mitchell shared details about her medical care, her prognosis, and their plans for managing the progression of her disease while protecting Lily and Owen from unnecessary anxiety about their own genetic risk. Their courage, love, and commitment to facing such devastating circumstances together was both inspiring and heartbreaking. As I drove home that evening, I was overwhelmed with shame about my rush to judgment and my failure to recognize that Meredith's behavior during Harold's funeral had been beyond her control. My anger and accusations had added unnecessary pain to someone who was already facing the most difficult challenge imaginable, and I realized how much I had missed about her character and her struggles by focusing on surface appearances rather than deeper realities. The woman I had dismissed as cold and secretive was actually demonstrating extraordinary courage and strength by hiding a devastating diagnosis while continuing to function as a loving wife, devoted mother, and contributing family member. Her laughter during Harold's eulogy hadn't been disrespect. It had been a neurological symptom of a disease that was slowly but inevitably destroying her brain. The secret that had made me freeze wasn't just about Huntington's disease or pseudobulbar affect. It was about the realization that I had completely misjudged someone who deserved my compassion, admiration, and support rather than my anger and criticism. The weeks following my discovery of Meredith's Huntington's disease diagnosis were filled with profound reflection, family conversations, and the gradual process of rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by misunderstanding and secrecy. I spent countless hours reading about Huntington's disease, educating myself about its symptoms, progression, and impact on families, while also grappling with my shame about how quickly I had judged Meredith's behavior without seeking to understand what might be causing it. My first priority was apologizing to Meredith in a way that acknowledged both my inappropriate reaction to her funeral behavior and my admiration for the strength and courage she had demonstrated while hiding such devastating news from our family. I wanted her to understand that my anger had been based on ignorance rather than insight, and that my respect for her character had actually increased dramatically once I understood what she had been enduring. Meredith, I need you to know how sorry I am for the way I reacted to your behavior at Harold's funeral, I said during one of our first conversations after her diagnosis disclosure. You were dealing with involuntary neurological symptoms while grieving Harold's death, and instead of offering support and understanding, I added judgment and criticism to your burden. Meredith's response was characteristically gracious and forgiving, reflecting the emotional maturity and strength that had enabled her to cope with her diagnosis while maintaining her family responsibilities. Ruth, you couldn't have known what was happening because I deliberately kept my condition secret. I understand why you were upset, and I don't blame you for reacting the way any normal person would react to seeing someone laugh during a funeral. Her ability to forgive my harsh judgment, while also taking responsibility for the confusion caused by her secrecy, demonstrated the kind of character and emotional intelligence that I had failed to recognize during the 5 years she had been part of our family. I realized that my preconceptions about her reserved nature and guarded behavior had prevented me from seeing the strength and complexity that made her such an extraordinary person. Over the following months, our family began the process of adjusting to the reality of Meredith's diagnosis and its implications for everyone's future. Mitchell had been carrying the emotional burden of his wife's condition largely alone, and he was relieved to finally have family support and understanding as they faced the challenges ahead. Having you know about Meredith's condition makes everything easier, Mitchell told me during one of our many conversations about family, planning, and medical care. I was trying to protect her privacy while also managing my own fears about what her diagnosis means for our family's future. We developed strategies for managing Meredith's pseudobulbar affect episodes during social situations, family gatherings, and public events, where her involuntary emotional outbursts might be misunderstood by people who didn't know about her medical condition. These strategies included code words that Mitchell or I could use to signal when Meredith needed to excuse herself from situations that were becoming too stressful, as well as explanations that we could offer to friends and community members who might witness her neurological symptoms. The most challenging aspect of adjusting to Meredith's diagnosis was figuring out how and when to discuss the situation with Lily and Owen. At 8 and 5 years old, they were too young to understand the complexities of genetic diseases or long-term prognosis, but they were beginning to notice that their mother sometimes behaved differently than other parents, and that family conversations sometimes stopped when they entered the room. "We want to be honest with them in age-appropriate ways," Meredith explained during one of our family planning conversations. "They need to understand that Mommy has a medical condition that sometimes makes her laugh or cry when she doesn't mean to, but they don't need to know about the genetic implications or the long-term prognosis until they're older." Meredith and Mitchell worked with child psychologists and genetic counselors to develop communication strategies that would help Lily and Owen understand their mother's symptoms without creating unnecessary anxiety about their own futures. The approach focused on explaining that medical conditions can affect people's emotions and behavior, while emphasizing that their mother's love for them remained constant, regardless of her neurological symptoms. I became actively involved in researching treatment options, support groups, and medical specialists who could help Meredith manage her symptoms and maintain her quality of life for as long as possible. While there is no cure for Huntington's disease, there are medications and therapies that can help control some symptoms and slow certain aspects of the disease's progression. "Ruth, your support and advocacy mean everything to our family," Meredith said as we attended one of her neurology appointments together. "Having someone who understands the situation and can help navigate the medical system makes this journey much less frightening and overwhelming." We also began planning for the practical aspects of Meredith's eventual care needs, including financial planning for medical expenses, home modifications that would accommodate her mobility challenges as the disease progressed, and legal documents that would protect her wishes and interests if her cognitive abilities became impaired. The funeral home and church members who had witnessed Meredith's behavior during Harold's service were quietly informed about her medical condition, which helped repair any damage to her reputation and ensured that future pseudobulbar affect episodes would be understood rather than judged. Pastor Williams was particularly supportive and helpful in educating our congregation about neurological conditions and the importance of showing compassion for people whose medical symptoms might appear unusual or inappropriate. Meredith's situation has taught our entire church community important lessons about judgment, compassion, and the hidden struggles that people carry with dignity and grace, Pastor Williams said during one of his sermons about supporting families facing medical challenges. 6 months after Harold's funeral, Meredith organized a fundraising event for the Huntington's Disease Society of America, using her real estate connections and marketing skills to raise awareness and money for research into treatments and potential cures. The event was successful both financially and emotionally, as it allowed Meredith to transform her personal struggle into meaningful contributions to other families facing similar challenges. "I want Lily and Owen to see that having a medical condition doesn't mean giving up or hiding from life," Meredith explained as she planned the fundraising event. "I want them to understand that people can face difficult circumstances with courage and use their experiences to help others." The event also provided opportunities for our family to connect with other Huntington's families and learn from people who were at different stages of the disease journey. These connections were invaluable for understanding what to expect and how to maintain hope and purpose despite the challenges ahead. Today, 18 months after Harold's funeral and Meredith's diagnosis disclosure, our family has developed a new closeness and appreciation for each other that has actually strengthened our relationships despite the medical challenges we're facing. Meredith's condition has progressed slowly, and she continues to work part-time in real estate while managing her symptoms and maintaining her role as wife and mother. Lily and Owen have adapted well to understanding their mother's medical condition, showing remarkable resilience and maturity in accepting that families sometimes face difficult challenges that require extra love and support. They've learned to recognize when their mother is having pseudo-bulbar affect episodes and to offer comfort rather than confusion when her emotional responses don't match the situation. Mommy's brain sometimes sends mixed-up signals, Lily explained to a friend who asked about Meredith's laughter during a sad movie. But she still loves us the same, and we still love her the same. The experience has taught me profound lessons about the danger of rushing to judgment and the importance of seeking to understand rather than simply reacting to behavior that seems inappropriate or confusing. Meredith's strength in facing such devastating circumstances while maintaining her dignity and family responsibilities has earned my deepest admiration and respect. I've also learned that compassion requires the humility to admit when we've been wrong and the courage to change our perspectives when new information challenges our assumptions. My initial anger about Meredith's funeral behavior was based on incomplete understanding and superficial judgment, while the truth revealed character strength and medical challenges that deserved support rather than criticism. The secret that had made me freeze, learning about Meredith's Huntington's disease and the genetic implications for my grandchildren, ultimately brought our family closer together and taught us that love, understanding, and mutual support are more important than appearances or social expectations. Sometimes what looks like inappropriate behavior is actually someone's heroic attempt to maintain normalcy while fighting battles that others can't see or understand. And sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is the assumption that their struggles are real and worthy of compassion, even when we don't immediately understand what those struggles involve. Meredith's laughter during Harold's funeral wasn't cruelty. It was courage in the face of a devastating diagnosis that she was hiding to protect the people she loved most. Her secret didn't make me freeze with anger. It made me freeze with admiration for someone whose strength and grace under impossible circumstances had been hidden behind a facade of normalcy that I had mistaken for coldness.